What did ancient Greek sound like at the beginning of the Koine period? The Old Testament translated into Greek, called the Septuagint, well, that's one of the texts from this time period. Or what about the historian Polybius, who in Greek wrote about the early conquests of the ancient Romans? What was his pronunciation like? Last year I made a video about the variants of Lucian pronunciation. Lucian pronunciation is a system of pronunciation conventions I developed for the sound of ancient Greek in the literary period that's called Koine, and in that video I showed you 6 variants of Lucian pronunciation that you could use to work with ancient Greek, whether teaching or reciting, whatever you want, especially if you want to recreate the sound of ancient Greek during the Koine period. And in that video I also showed you how these Koine era pronunciations differ from the sound of classical Attic. Some of the variants of Lucian pronunciation are more conservative, that is, they are more similar to classical Attic, while others are more innovative, that is, more similar to medieval or modern Greek. But
there is one last thing.
Of the 6 variants I've talked about so far, the most conservative is called Romaic Lucian pronunciation, and it's an excellent model for the sound of ancient Greek in the 1st century BC, in classical Roman times. And it's also pretty good thereafter as well for at least a couple of centuries. But even though it's the most conservative of the variants, well, there's this whole other period in Koine that I kind of skipped over between classical Attic and that 1st century BC pronunciation, that Romaic Lucian pronunciation. So in this video, we're going to explore what I'm calling for now Hellenistic Lucian pronunciation, the sound of the Septuagint, the sound of Polybius and other authors. I'm Luke, and this is polýMATHY. This video is brought to you by the Ancient Language Institute, where you can sign up for lessons in Ancient Greek, Latin, Biblical Hebrew, and Old English. But make sure you do so by August 10th to get a spot in the fall semester. Now, as a teacher at Ancient Language Institute, I have to say how amazing it is for me to teach a group of Latin or Ancient Greek students who have graduated from beginner to intermediate level, people I've never met before though, yet who are already fluent in basic conversation thanks to their beginner ALI courses, and from the first day, we're able to conduct class entirely in Latin or Ancient Greek without resorting to English to explain even complex topics we read in our primary source materials. Now this shows just how effective ALI's application is of the direct method. Ancient Language Institute teaches you how to read fluently, how to discuss, in the target language, the literature you are immersing yourself in. This is the key to proficiency in an ancient language. This autumn, ALI is proudly continuing its Latin for Kids program, where elementary, middle, and high school students can enroll in a year-long course from September to June and get a fantastic experience learning the language of the ancient Romans. And if you're already at the intermediate or advanced level, ALI offers a number of courses, seminars, and private tutoring as well. Learn more and sign up for lessons today at ancientlanguage.com. The Hellenistic Koine period is arbitrarily demarcated by the death of Alexander in 323 BC and the Battle of Actium in 31 BC. Why these dates? Well, Alexander the Great spread classical Attic Greek in a form we may call Great Attic, the common Greek of the Athenian Empire, also called the Delian League, all across his vast empire. And as this Greek was common to everyone, it takes its name from the ancient Greek word for common, he koine dialectos, as said in the classical Attic pronunciation. Seeds of Greek influence continued to take root all around the Eastern Mediterranean for centuries, and so we call this the Hellenistic period of Greek culture. It's followed by the point where Roman influence dominates the Greek world. To mark this change, we could arbitrarily choose the date 146 BC, the Battle of Corinth, which resulted in the ultimate annexation of Greece, and say that the Roman period of Greek culture and civilization started then. Most scholars seem to prefer the Battle of Actium in 31 BC. Cleopatra died the year after in 30 BC, and Egypt would remain a Roman province until the Arab conquests. So how did Hellenistic Greek pronunciation differ from that of classical Attic? On the whole, it's quite similar, but there are a few vowel and consonant shifts. The only major consonant shift to take note of is that of zeta. In classical Attic, this is pronounced zda, such as in the word zdoe, life. In Hellenistic times, the zda pronunciation seems to have been largely replaced by geminated z. Thus, the word for life in Hellenistic Koine pronunciation would be zoe. Attic inscriptions show evidence for the change from zda to z as early as 342 BC, such as in the spelling ergasmenon, using zeta in place of sigma in front of voiced mu. In Classical Attic, and in fact Greek of every period in geography, sigma in front of voiced consonants like mu or nu, delta, gamma, etc. is necessarily z, it's voiced. The surprise here is that the letter that in Classical Attic had to be zda is now being used interchangeably with sigma in this position. Spelling confusions of this variety increase in frequency in the 3rd century BC onward, such that we can be sure that geminated z is the general pronunciation of the letter in Koine Greek. See a much more in-depth analysis of all of this in my video on zeta on this channel, as well as this video on the auxiliary channel polýMATHY Plus. The most dramatic vowel shift in Hellenistic Koine is that of the digraph epsilon iota, which was not a diphthong in Classical Attic. In Classical Attic, this is pronounced e, a long, high, mid-front vowel. Before consonants, this vowel is raised to e. If this discussion about precise phonology and phonetics and the usage of these international phonetic alphabet characters is a bit confusing, don't worry, I have videos for you. See this one and this one to learn more about IPA. So the Classical Attic pronunciation of epsilon iota is e, a long, high, mid, front vowel. Before consonants, this vowel is raised to e in Hellenistic Koine. Thus the word for image or icon, pronounced egon in Classical Attic, comes to be pronounced egon, starting in the 3rd century BC. But before vowels, it retains its Classical Attic quality of e. So the city of Alexandria retains a pronunciation quite similar, if not identical, to that of Classical Attic. Alexandria. We know that iota and epsilon iota merge in quality before consonants because of spelling errors in Hellenistic times that show their interchange, and similarly that epsilon iota must retain a more open quality before vowels since it's occasionally misspelled with the letter eta. Here are a couple inscriptions that demonstrate this. This one, dated to before 167 BC, Alexandreais drachmais pentekonta, and this one circa 24 BC, Kais Alexandrian. In contrast, we can see that epsilon iota has regularly shifted to merge with long iota before consonants. Here in an inscription from circa 130 to 110 BC, Todeis teni kona. See my epsilon iota video for more detailed information on this. Those are the most dramatic changes from a general Classical Attic pronunciation to a general Hellenistic Koine pronunciation. But we have another subtle change in the mid-vowels. Epsilon and eta tend to merge in quality, so we can assume they are both true mid e, while omicron and omega also merge in quality to true o. Classical Attic, in contrast, has eta and omega as o, long open mid vowels. The quality merger is known due to the increasing spelling confusions of these letters. Also, in the Hellenistic period, we expect omicron hupsilon to raise from u, as it is in Classical Attic, to u, where it stays for all of Koine. Indeed, that's the quality of this digraph all the way to the present day. However, Hellenistic Koine generally retains the aspirated stops k, t, p, exactly as they are in Classical Attic pronunciation. See the Variants of Lucian Pronunciation video to learn about exactly when and where these become the fricatives ch, th, f. Also, the diphthongs I, ui, au, eu tend to retain their Classical Attic value in Hellenistic Koine. And if you recall that long and exciting video, Variants of Lucian Pronunciation, you'll recognize that this Hellenistic Koine pronunciation that I'm presenting to you sounds a lot like the Romaic Lucian pronunciation. And you're right! But there is one key difference. The long diphthongs of Classical Attic are retained into Hellenistic times. In Classical Attic, the long diphthongs are pronounced I, a, oi. Sometimes they're written with the iota subscript, other times they're written with the iota adscript. Long diphthongs are very important to the inflectional morphology of ancient Greek, as they mark the dative singular of first and second declension nouns. For these examples, I'll use the classical Attic pronunciation. Biai kretai. They also mark the subjunctive of many verbs, like legeis, legei. The middle voice of others, like bolei, and even the present indicative for contract verbs like horais, horai. Now these long diphthongs merge with their long vowel counterparts by the beginning of Roman Koine in the mid-1st century BC. So in Romaic Lucian pronunciation, these are said bia kretai, leges, lege, boule, horas, hora. Due to the loss of distinct long diphthongs in speech by the 1st century BC, the habit of writing the iota is in severe decline by that century, and many inscriptions reflect this fact. For example, rhapsode, written rhapsoidos in this inscription from the 3rd to 2nd century BC, whereas it's written rhapsodos here in an inscription dated to the 2nd to 1st century BC. This may be further observed in Greek words borrowed into Latin. Rhapsodus is a later loan from around the 1st century BC, while gomoidia, from gomoidia in classical Attic pronunciation, had been borrowed into Latin earlier, from around the 2nd century BC, or perhaps the 3rd century BC. Thus the iota in these digraphs was left out of most inscriptions and papyri until about the 2nd century AD, during the Second Sophistic, which was a literary movement in the Greek world something like a Renaissance, during which authors and grammarians lionized the Attic authors, their vocabulary, their grammar, and even their spelling. Thus the iota was added back in writing, where it ought to have been there in classical Attic and Hellenistic Koine, though it's unlikely anyone was pronouncing it in the 2nd century AD, although I haven't found any testimony yet from even the strict grammarians of the Second Sophistic that have definitely said that it is or is not pronounced. Such commentary would be very informative if we could find it. In the 12th century AD, Byzantine philologists started to write the silent iota of these digraphs under the vowel, creating the modern custom of representing the long diphthongs as iota subscripts, although sometimes you'll see texts with adscripts as well. Among the original goals of the Lucian pronunciation system was to find one or more historical phonologies that could be practical conventions. In my observations of people attempting to recite or speak in classical Attic phonology, where pronunciation of the long diphthongs is mandatory, I had noticed virtually every one of these speakers merging the short diphthongs, I and oi, with the long diphthongs, I, oi. Of course, the contrast between epsilon iota and eta iota should not present any difficulty since, as we mentioned, the epsilon iota is not a diphthong, but is the long monophthong e, while eta iota is a. However, this confusion is hardly their fault. Distinguishing long diphthongs from short diphthongs isn't something most people know how to do, as it doesn't occur in their native languages. It takes a long time and a lot of effort to master the vital characteristics of Attic pronunciation. Nevertheless, this is why using a historical Koine pronunciation from the Roman period seemed like a better basis for my recommendations. It avoids the long diphthongs entirely, leaving that iota silent just as it is in the Erasmian pronunciation that most people are familiar with. That's why, before today, I didn't think it especially important to talk about the 7th variant of Lucian pronunciation, being the Hellenistic variant of Lucian pronunciation, since it was so similar to both classical Attic and Romaic Lucian. However, as I have begun to use Hellenistic Lucian pronunciation for the Septuagint and Polybius and other Hellenistic authors, I've found that it does indeed have a character all its own. Moreover, having heard other colleagues use Hellenistic Lucian pronunciation, who have chosen it as their favorite, I now feel that it's worth presenting publicly. If one is accustomed to using the long diphthongs correctly, and also used to hearing them said correctly by others, then there are great advantages to their employment. Since they mark so many inflectional endings in nouns and adjectives and pronouns and verbs, they definitely add to comprehensibility. This is again with the very important caveat that the long diphthongs be pronounced distinctly from short diphthongs. Philosopiae, philosophies, and philosopiae, by means of a philosophy, must sound different from one another. Merging them is not consistent with historical phonology. Another advantage to mastering long diphthongs is it allows one to recreate the majority of historical BC Greek pronunciations, both classical and Hellenistic. This can be of great use to understanding how and why authors wrote the way they did. Take the relative pronouns he and hei. The first means which or that, feminine singular, and the second means for which, feminine singular. But pronouncing these he and hei, that's the classical Attic pronunciation. These end up sounding real similar if they're leveled to he and he. The accent still distinguishes them, showing the indispensable utility of pitch accent in ancient Greek, but we may nevertheless expect Roman Koine authors to add additional particles and words to strengthen the distinction, such as the more frequent use of hetis and heitini, which mean roughly the same thing, but if we pronounce these as they are in most of the Roman Koine period, these would simply be hetis and heitini. That enclitic really clarifies the difference. This also means that not pronouncing the iota in long diphthongs is a way for us to intuitively learn something about the subtle change of diction and syntax and word usage in Roman Koine. Naturally, all of these historical pronunciation variants are valid reconstructions and good choices for representing the sound of ancient Greek, especially if we want to use one or the other for specific authors, or simply to use any of them in our interactions with ancient Greek or speaking ancient Greek with others. There is, however, a funky thing about the long diphthong eta iota, noted by Allen and Threet. You see, there's evidence that this long diphthong was becoming monophthongal as early as the end of the classical Attic period in the 4th century BC. Spellings such as gleis instead of the older Attic gleis for key show a possible pronunciation change. Here's an example from circa 310 to 300 BC. Gleida for gleida. But I also want to show you that there's likely a period of transition going on here. Or maybe different accents in different regions, even different demes in Attica. Here's an example with gleidas from 296 BC. That's just a few years after the Gleida inscription we saw a second ago. Now, the idea that we could find a time period in which epsilon iota, that long diphthong a, is monophthongizing into a before the other long diphthongs is not really that unexpected of a development, since a was always the narrowest of the long diphthongs, and narrow diphthongs tend to monophthongize more readily. However, in the 3rd century BC, there's a sudden reversal of this trend, and we find many more of the correct, that is prescriptively speaking, spellings with eta iota. Theodorson notes that a number of reforms occurred in Hellenistic Attic, in particular during the 3rd century BC, and he hypothesizes, convincingly in my opinion, that Attic from classical times onward shows an internal competition between more innovative pronunciations, what Theodorson calls vulgar Attic, for which see my video on this topic on the auxiliary channel polýMATHY Plus, as well as this video on Scorpio Martianus, and what we call classical Attic. During the 2 centuries of Athenian democracy, all the citizens of Attica were party to the system of the control and authority, and thus a wide range of innovative pronunciations from these demes came to be popular. Upon Athens' conquest by the Macedonians, who sought to educate the lands they conquered in the prestigious classical Attic dialect, the innovative phonologies of Vulgar Attic went into severe decline. That means that the greater Greek world was exposed to a more conservative version of classical Attic spread by the Macedonians, and that Attica itself, rather ironically, lost nearly all of the trendy Attic innovations that had been growing in popularity since the 5th century BC. Thus, Athenians had imposed upon them the style of speech of their grandfathers, and Hellenistic Attic, by and large, tended to resemble classical Attic, as we have come to know and love it, more closely than the language of the majority of Attic speakers during the classical period. Sound confusing? See the videos I mentioned. And such restorations are not unheard of in history. A prominent example is that H had been virtually lost as a sound in English of Shakespeare's day, as that was the popular and classy thing to do. Drop your H's. This is why, to this day, we don't pronounce the H in honor, nor in the name of the letter itself, H, except in some places like Ireland, where they still say H. In the 1700s, grammarians began to recommend the clear pronunciation of H, and in time, the sound was restored to almost every word in the language. This reform didn't reach every Englishman, however, as some of them were already on their way to North America. Thus, Americans say herb, while Brits, having benefited from a fuller restoration, say herb. So the eta iota diphthong was restored, especially in the inflectional endings, which lasted till about the 1st century BC. And in my convention for Hellenistic Koine, I prescribe the pronunciation of eta iota as a. So what is this convention exactly? Up to this point, I've shown you that there are distinct characteristics to the pronunciation of ancient Greek in this time period, that is from about 323 BC to 31 BC. How does this coalesce into a single convention that we can call Hellenistic Lucian Pronunciation? Well, let's look at a bit of the Septuagint in Hellenistic Lucian Pronunciation. Here's Genesis 1:30. Kai pasitois teriois tesges, kai pasitois petinois tuuranu, kai panti herpetoi herponti epitesges, huekien heotoi psyken zoes, kai panta korton chloron is brosin, kai egeneto hutos. If your starting point is Romaic Lucian Pronunciation, it's pretty easy to step backward into Hellenistic Lucian Pronunciation. The only prominent difference is that the long diphthongs are retained. Here's how the long diphthongs compare from Classical Attic into Hellenistic Lucian. I, these are identical. A, the diphthong is more narrow. Oi, again, this diphthong is also more narrow. So precisely, what is that difference? Well, the first component of these last two, the long vowels eta and omega, are both true mid rather than open mid, just as plain eta and omega in Hellenistic Lucian Pronunciation. This is a plausible reconstruction, anticipating future changes, and also makes the phonology easier for most people. Another difference from Romaic Lucian is that Hellenistic Lucian's short diphthongs, alpha iota and omicron iota, are still broader, ai, oi, rather than the narrow diphthongs, ai, oi. This is because it makes it easier to distinguish them from the long diphthongs, ai, oi. For the sake of comparison, we'll look at Genesis 1:30 once again, but first in Classical Attic, then Hellenistic Lucian, then Romaic Lucian. Classical Attic pronunciation. Kai pasitois teriois desges, kai pasitois petenois torano, kai panti herpetoi herponti epitesges, huekien heotoi psyken stoes, kai panta korton chloron es brosin, kai egeneto hutos. Hellenistic Lucian pronunciation. Kai pasitois teriois desges, kai pasitois petinois toranu, kai panti herpetoi herponti epitesges, huekien heotoi psyken zoes, kai panta korton chloron is brosin, kai egeneto hutos. Romaic Lucian pronunciation. Kai pasitois teriois desges, kai pasitois petinois toranu, kai panti herpeto herponti epitesges, huekien heotoi psyken zoes, kai panta korton chloron is brosin, kai egeneto hutos. So those are the differences. The long diphthongs are present or not. The qualities of certain vowels are changed. The zeta is different. Not enormous changes, but noticeable. Now let's hear a little of Polybius in Hellenistic Lucian Pronunciation. This is from the introduction to Book 1 of his Histories. Pantes ho seposipi narkei kai teli ke krentai tutoi, pasconte saletino taten neninai paidean, ke gymnasiam prostas politicas praxis, tenectes historias matesin. Enarges taten de kai monen didascalon tu dynastai tas tes duces metabolas, genaios hypoperin tenton allotrion peripeteon hypomnesin. Another quote from Polybius. Jenny Teichman recently cited this line from Polybius in her Ancient Greek Language podcast called Ancient Greek with Argos, which I recommend you subscribe to. Katholu de Romaioi prospanda chromenoi dei biai, kai to proteten oiomenoi katananken epitelin, kai meden adunaton ais pisiton hapax dog santon, en poloismen katortus idiaten toyauten hormen, en tiside propanos palontai, kai malistentois katatalatan. Here's another Polybius line that Jenny covered in her podcast on the Romans. Diokai polakis idiin estin entais ton Romaion catalepsesi ton polion, monontus anthropus peponeomenus, alekai tus gynas dedicotome menus, kai tonalon zoion mele parekecom mena. So on the whole, I'd say that Hellenistic Lucian pronunciation is a bit easier than classical Attic pronunciation for most people. Rather than distinguishing between open mid, true mid, and closed mid qualities for epsilon iota, epsilon eta, and omicron, upsilon, omicron, and omega, which may be more challenging, the long closed mid vowels have raised to close vowels, and the others are true mid. The classical Attic zeta, which is the, isn't the most challenging sound there is, but I dare say that the z is a bit more comfortable, and you get that in Hellenistic Lucian. Naturally, just like all the conventions of Lucian pronunciation, phonemic vowel length, consonant length, and pitch accent are strictly prescribed, just as in classical Attic pronunciation. One more thing worthy of mention regarding omega iota. Theodorson and others note that omega iota is not often confused with plain omega in Hellenistic and early Roman times. And Ben Cantor provides data for this as well in Judean Greek. Theodorson opines that when the long diphthong omega iota underwent monophthongization, it remained an open aw for some time. There's a good possibility of this. Another possibility is that the omega iota diphthong was the last of the three to monophthongize. Eta iota was the first to monophthongize since the components of that diphthong are near to each other, a, both front vowels, making for a narrow diphthong. I collapsed next, as open central vowel a is further away from e than e, and finally o is the furthest away, thus oi or oi is the broadest of these diphthongs. That's why it should be the last to monophthongize. One could certainly play with these possibilities in one's own reconstruction. The conventions of Lucian pronunciation are meant to be practicable as well as historically grounded, so that you can use them as they are, or as a starting point for your own historical reconstruction. And some of the innovations in Greek phonology that are represented in other Lucian pronunciation variants could have begun for some speakers in Hellenistic times. As you probably know, Lucian pronunciation is named after Lucian of Samosata, a famous Greek author who lived right in the middle of the Koine period in the 2nd century AD. It's not named after me. But if thinking of my name is somehow a useful mnemonic for recalling the system, that's fine. It's just not the original intent. When it comes to speaking or just reciting ancient Greek, almost any convention will do. There are advantages and disadvantages to any of them. A convention that represents the sound of ancient Greek at some point in its ancient history is my preference, whether classical Attic pronunciation or one of the variants of Lucian pronunciation, or even Boothian pronunciation. But pronunciations that don't have much to do with ancient Greek phonology, like Erasmian or modern Greek pronunciation, well, they'll get the job done too. Just like those two, one can speak and recite Latin texts in the ecclesiastical pronunciation of Latin. That pronunciation is very far removed from the sound of Latin in antiquity, but if you're just reading or discussing the text and not too concerned with the musicality of the prose or the poetry, it's great. And speaking and communicating with others is not any more of a problem than an American and a Brit holding down a conversation. Something I do strongly suggest, though, is the practice of reciting Latin and ancient Greek in more than one pronunciation convention, since it really helps you get used to the different ways you might hear these languages spoken, and increases your listening comprehension. I also recommend seeing the full variants of Lucian pronunciation video, since I think that's a really useful way to get a sense of the continuity of change of the Greek language from antiquity all the way up to the medieval period. It's very dramatic. So, what do you think of this Hellenistic Lucian pronunciation convention? Will you use it to recite texts from the Hellenistic Koine period? I already know some people who are already teaching and learning using that pronunciation system. They like it very much. You should try it too. Well, if you want. If we do that, if we actually try to use pronunciation systems from different time periods, What do you think we might discover about these authors, about their writings? Will we learn new things about their word choice, certain things that they like to use, certain things they like to avoid? Will we discover all that? What else do you think? Let me know in the comments, and thanks for watching. Thanks especially as well to the Ancient Language Institute for supporting this video, and to each and every one of my Patreon supporters. Hugiainete kai warete.